Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for another short class, and we are going to be looking at this time the Charge of the Light Brigade, and this is by Alfred Tennyson. Okay, so if you haven't seen the other poems analysis, then please do go and watch those, so they are also mentioned as well within this playlist. Okay, so let's have a look at the title. So, The Charge of the Light Brigade. So, that's something that's quite interesting. You'll find perhaps a lot of students getting slightly confused with bayonet charge, which comes later on as well, because there's charge here as well. But the Light Brigade, you want to, just to help you remember this, the brigade gives the impression that there's many, and that's one of the main differences between this and the other, where the bayonet charge is more of a personal individual account, whereas this is more of a collective charge, and that's something that is quite important. We're going to have a look at that shortly. Okay, so as I would do normally, so we've got a few quotes here highlighted in red. Those are perhaps the ones that you'd want to go with. Start off with those, and there's two more that are in green. If you feel that you can look to bring those in as well, then by all means go for those as well. Right, let's have a look at the poem and make sure that we know what it's about first. So, of course, this has some historical context to it as well, and this is a tribute basically to men, men who died in the battle in the Crimean War, and that's between 1853 and 1856. So it's a war between Britain and other Allied forces as well, alongside or against rather Russian forces and others as well. But this is primarily focusing on the British cavalry, a group of approximately 600 or so, and they are going against Russian forces. So within the poem, it talks about how there's a misunderstanding and a real blunder, to quote Tennyson, by the officials and those that are in charge. So they ordered a group of 600 more or less to charge forward into a valley. However, they made a huge error, and the majority of these men suddenly lost their lives. They were outnumbered and they were completely unprepared. So the soldiers arrived, or went charged forward rather, with more or less swords, and the enemy soldiers had machine guns and were able to really just pick them off, and it was done very easily. So the Light Brigade were mostly just defenseless, and there wasn't really much of a chance for them to survive. So there's mixed feelings really coming out of this poem from Tennyson, which he's trying to put forward. So feelings of admiration that we can celebrate the 600, this group who charged forward, but then also, well, and alongside that, putting forward the feeling of patriotism and also horror too, really criticizing without directly really targeting those that are in charge, but really sort of just critiquing and really getting the public to think about the decision making, and of course, by extension, then getting them to think about whether we should put our trust in them and believe some of the messages, pre-war messages that they may put out. Okay, so some of the quotes, we'll have a look at the first one. So starting with the first line, and it just more or less just moves on to the next line as well. So half a league, half a league, half a league onward. So quite interesting. So it does give the impression um, of a sort of rhythm here as well. So it seems to be going relatively well initially forward as they charge forward, and they seem to have some sort of structure and order, and they seem to be in good spirits, feeling very patriotic and having confidence. However, of course, that's something that quickly changes as well. Half a league. Now that also perhaps the half a league repetition there as well could just give an indication perhaps they were missing some elements there. So just a half a league, giving the idea, okay, well, they're not completely strengthened here, and they do perhaps have some weaknesses within them in terms of not having a full unit and a huge number in terms of soldiers and so on. The confidence that they have soon changes. I'm going to look at some quotes as well. So some other quotes in addition to what I've not put there would include there's not to make reply, there's not to reason why. So I've sort of mentioned that there in green, but some of the other quotes there as well, that would be very useful, that you want to just maybe think about bringing those in, any of those really, where theirs is mentioned. So that just really helps to go into some of the points there of how they were incredibly obedient. And of course, this causes us to admire them, where perhaps they may have had some doubts regarding the decision making and the situation. However, they were model soldiers, according to Tennyson here, or at least that's the impression that's been put forward there. So the next quote, all the world wondered. So really a couple of meanings we could take from this with this alliteration here. So all the world wondered. So the world potentially would wonder at just how the soldiers were able to charge forward in this incredibly brave manner. They potentially knew, perhaps even the officials knew as well, that they were massively outnumbered and they were not really prepared for this situation. But the way that the soldiers charged forward, despite the odds going against them, that really says a lot perhaps about the level of patriotism of the British soldiers and the bravery and their immense courage. So perhaps that's what they're hoping for. At least that's the feeling Tennyson's putting forward here, that this, whilst they may have lost their lives, a lot of people around the world would have really held the British and British soldiers in high regard. Also, as well, the world wondered. So the wondered could also be a reference to the decision making as well. So a couple of feelings really being targeted here. So wondering at, what made them think that this would be a good decision? What caused them to go ahead and do something like this? The world was wondering, how could they not um, be more prepared in this sort of situation? And finally, I've got with Noble 600. So you can see here, just towards the end of each stanza, so rode the 600, in quite a few stanzas there, and left of 600, and Noble 600. So whilst in the earlier stanzas it talks about how they were charging forward and still charging forward, and then sort of towards the final few stanzas or so seems to be now changing, where now they seem to be losing their numbers, and hence you've got the 600 and then left of 600 there as well, just before the final stanza. But in the final stanza, you do have Noble 600, which is something the poet wants to end with. So whilst perhaps they were unprepared, whilst they were victims really of the poor decision making at the top, whilst it perhaps highlights the incredibly dire situation of being at war and being on the battlefield. He still wants to end with that positive note and perhaps just creating the feeling that their deaths were not in vain. Another quote, actually, I just want to bring in, which I haven't highlighted here. I feel that this is a really good one. So, when can their glory fade? So, that's something really just backs up a lot of the points there in this final stanza. It is mostly just honoring the 600 rather than going into details of some of the horrible situations they face. For example, being surrounded by cannons and so on. It appears to be very grim, and we perhaps feel very saddened by the pain they would have experienced in their final moments. However, when can their glory fade? That's something just trying to challenge that. It's a rhetorical question, and of course, just trying to put forward that nothing will really sort of stop the praise of their sacrifices. Some of the other quotes, so as I mentioned before, so there's not to reply, I reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. So we've got these sibilants here. So one of the effects of sibilants you should be aware of is to create a sinister feeling and or threatening feeling, and that's certainly something that we have here. So it really sounds very vicious and really gives the impression that they were really struggling and, of course, hit by all sides by the Russian forces. Okay, so those are some of their feelings and some of the key quotes and what the poem is about. So remember, you do want to understand what the poems are about, and you do want to look to get a few quotes memorized as well of the poems. Okay, so this was The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Tennyson. I hope it was useful. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.